Thank you, Daryl. That was a really great introduction. I really appreciate it. It's such an honor to be here at Beacon, to be part of the Salon series. I'm just so honored. It's really nice to come back. I see that, COVID has passed, everyone's coming out again, and it's just so nice to see all these faces and to be able to talk to you tonight. It's just a real honor, so thank you for coming. I'm going to start by walking you through the Groveland story. This is a story that, from Devil in the Grove. I think it's really important to understand a little bit of the history, what was happening at the time. Basically, it's right after World War II. It begins. And one of the things I found really interesting is that you had nearly 1 million African-American servicemen coming back from war. And many of them were expected to slip quietly back into that Jim Crow lifestyle. And it was offensive to a lot of them who were willing to fight and die for this country. And here they are, saying that they got greater freedoms and greater respect abroad in France and Italy. You could see like the way that they were treated abroad made them, think, well, I fought for this country and here I am having to go back into this second-class lifestyle. And so one of the things they often did was they would continue to wear their military uniforms, kind of a silent protest to sort of say, I remind citizens I was willing to die for this country. But there were really no protests back at this time after World War II. And so that act of wearing that uniform was sort of seen as something that was provocative, and sometimes they use the word uppity. Why are they putting it in our face like that? And one of the aftermath, one of the results of this post-World War II in the Jim Crow South is that you started to see in the summer of 1946 a wave of soldier lynchings across the South. African Americans in their military uniforms being lynched in that terrible summer of 1946. And so that was sort of the environment, the post-war environment that Thurgood Marshall was coming into when he came down to take this case. I'll just give you a rundown of what this case is really about. It's the summer of 1949. Norma Paget, Willie Paget, young married couple. Norma's 17, Willie's a couple years older. They've already been separated from their marriage. There was, some rumors going on. They were not having a healthy relationship. Families wanted them separated. That went on for a few months, and then they got back together, try to rekindle their romance, I guess. And so in July of 1949, they went out and basically picked up a bottle of whiskey, went out dancing in Claremont at American Legion, and something happens as they're leaving. They want to go out for a late night snack in Okahumpka, and something happens. We're not really quite sure, but it's on the side of the road on the way towards Okahumpka. And the next thing we know is that Norma Paget has made these accusations that she has been abducted and sexually assaulted by 4 African Americans. And so what ends up happening is word gets out, and the Ku Klux Klan rolls into Lake County by the hundreds and starts burning down homes in the black section of Groveland, Stuckey Still. This is remarkable that people coming as far away from Georgia, and they're targeting these homes, and the reason they're targeting these homes is because those are the suspects that Sheriff Willis McCall has decided were responsible for this act against Norma Paget. And so they start rounding up African Americans in this part of Groveland. Remarkable. Homes are being burned down. They're arresting, taking the suspects, alleged suspects, into the basement of the jail, handcuffing them to the pipes and beating them so severely that 2 of the Groveland boys confessed. The third, Walter Irvin, just passed out unconscious but refused to confess. And so word got out, started out as the Groveland 4. Ernest Thomas, the 4th suspect, sees what's happening. He doesn't want to stick around in town. He flees up to northern Florida, up into the swamps. And Sheriff McCall puts together a posse of more than 1,000 men and basically shoot him dead. I mean, they're not going to bring him home alive. I think the coroner's report, or one report said that he was, they pulled 400 slugs from his body. So Ernest Thomas was not going to be brought home alive. So now they're down to 3 defendants, Walter Irvin, Sam Shepard, and 16-year-old Charles Greenlee. Charles Greenlee wasn't even in the area at the time of this. He was actually locked up for trespassing in a Groveland jail cell. He was documented, but it didn't matter because they needed 4 people to fulfill this accusation. And so Charles Greenlee was taken and arrested and charged with this crime. I think what's really disturbing about this is if you look, compare it to today, back then, after the arrests, it wasn't until 30 days later that these men are standing accused in court of these charges that were, capital case charges. They're going to get the death penalty. And so they go forward with this trial. Thurgood Marshall sends down a couple lawyers to defend the Groveland boys, but it's a horrible, the railroading has already begun. Jury is selected. They go through the trial. It's basically, I won't go into the trial too much. It's basically an abomination of justice. You had perjury, every instance. You had prosecutorial misconduct. You had the manufacturing of evidence. And so the trial was really a foregone conclusion. Marshall was told that you can't have an African-American lawyer standing in court and questioning the word of a white accuser. That would be the surest way to send these defendants to the electric chair. And so Marshall has to hire a white lawyer expressly for the purpose of cross-examining white witnesses, so it's not seen as offensive to the jury. African Americans standing there and arguing law or questioning the word of a witness. The trial, I won't get into it too much, but it was a travesty. And Thurgood Marshall knew this was going to happen. This is the way things worked in his experience in the South. He would come down and take these airtight cases where it was obvious what had happened, but they could never win. They could never get any kind of acquittals because the juries were sort of, community juries that were, they were friendly with the police, they were friendly with the prosecutor, everybody knew everybody, and you had a certain role to play. It wasn't just the police, it wasn't just the prosecutor, it was also the jury. In order to support the structure of white supremacy, the jury had a role to play. And that's what you sort of saw, and Marshall was aware of it. His big strategy was to get the case before the US Supreme Court. That was what he felt would be the most way to get the most closest thing to justice. He felt that the US Supreme Court represented a level playing field. And so that's what he decides to do. He decides to appeal it until he gets it to the US Supreme Court. So the day arrives when the case is argued before the justices, and Marshall is there with his lawyers. You can see he was very confident. He's got an impeccable record before the US Supreme Court, really got the dream team of lawyers. If you were accused of anything, a crime like this, there was no team that you'd want except for Thurgood Marshall's lawyers at the Legal Defense Fund. This was like a dream team, the best and the brightest. And so they show up at the Supreme Court and they're feeling really confident. They know they're going to win. And that's exactly what happens. They get in there, they argue the case. Justice Robert Jackson writes the opinion. And the opinion basically says, his language is, this case presents one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice. On those grounds, I overturn. Basically what he says. He goes on to say that, basically insinuate the media made an environment that was not favorable at all to the defense. The way the grand jury was selected was, basically constitutionally illegal. And so they had a very firm ground. But what Justice Jackson was really saying with that opinion was like, I'm looking at the whole case, not just the issues that these defendants appealed on. I'm looking at the whole case, and it was an abomination of justice. And so at that moment, after the Supreme Court announces their decision, basically overturning the verdict in Lake County, it basically orders a new trial. And at that point, Sheriff Willis McCall has an idea. If the court is going to insist on a new trial, he says, I'll go up personally, pick up the defendants, and bring them back down for the retrial. And so that's what he does. He gets in a car with his deputy, James Yates. They split up in cars, drive up to Rayford together. Willis McCall takes Walter Irvin and Sam Shepard, handcuffs them, and starts driving back to Lake County from Rayford. And gets into Lake County, and then he takes a little detour down a side road. And that's where the story really gets to be traumatic in my point of view. And he starts jiggling the wheel of the car, and he says, I think I got a flat. And he pulls over on the side of the road, and he comes around, he says, you boys get out, fix this flat. And as soon as Sam Shepard starts to get out of the car, he pulls his revolver, shoots 3 times. Sam Shepard, killed instantly. Shot twice in the torso, once in the head. He's dead instantly. Walter Irvin is handcuffed to his best friend, Sam Shepard. Next thing he knows, he's shot twice, once in the chest and once in the side, in his ribs. McCall grabs him, pulls him out on the ground, and basically sees these 2 guys laying in the ditch. Walter Irvin, miraculously, is still alive. He's only pretending to be dead because he's handcuffed to his best friend. He can't run anywhere, he can't do anything. His only form of survival is to just pretend to be dead. And so that's what he does. And he says, I hear him get on the radio and call his deputy back. The deputy comes back. He can hear the car driving. He can hear the footsteps approaching him. And then he feels this light flashing over his face. And at that point, he opens his eyes and he hears the deputy say, "This one's still alive." Pulls out his revolver and fires a 3rd shot into Walter Irvin. That bullet goes straight through his neck, clean through. And miraculously, again, Walter Irvin is not dead. And he says, at that point, Willis McCall goes back to the car, gets on the radio and says, "I got him good, get back here." Brings his deputy back. Deputy shoots. Then what they do is they start to manufacture an escape attempt. They start ripping at Sheriff Willis McCall's clothes. They actually take hair from Willis McCall's head, pull it out, and put it in Sam Shepard's hand to sort of get this story that this is an escape attempt. 15 minutes later, witnesses start arriving. The 2 Groveland boys are laying in the ditch still, and Sheriff McCall is just walking around saying, "I hated to do it. They tried to escape. It was either them or me. They went after me. I had to shoot in self-defense." He starts telling the story. Ambulance comes, takes Sheriff McCall to the hospital. They bring Walter Irvin to the hospital in a hearse because there's no ambulances that will transport African Americans at the time. Bring him to the hospital. He starts telling a very different story. He starts telling a story of cold-blooded murder. And when he's telling the story about being shot that 3rd time, the FBI is in that room, and they're listening to this. And they've already got statements from Sheriff Willis McCall. And they're saying, well, if McCall's version is true, we're never going to find that 6th bullet. They've located all 5 of the other bullets in the bodies of Sam Shepard and Walter Irvin. But if Sheriff McCall's telling the truth, they're never going to find that 6th bullet because it went clean through the neck. But Walter Irvin, if he's telling the truth, they have an idea where that 6th bullet might be. And so the FBI goes back to the crime scene, and they find that bloody stain from the night before where Walter Irvin was laying, and they take out a shovel and they start digging. Underneath, 10 inches below the surface of that bloodstain, they find a .38 caliber bullet. Now they have forensic proof that the sheriff and his deputy are lying and that Walter Irvin is telling the truth. He was shot just as he described in the dirt right there. This is probably the most traumatic part of the story because the FBI writes a report urging investigation, and it's quashed by the U.S. Attorney and by the Department of Justice. No one ever learns the light of day. This whole story just gets buried in the FBI files, and they go on to a second trial. Second trial, there's only one defendant left, Walter Irvin, convicted, sentenced to death. This story became the official narrative that Sheriff Willis McCall fired in self-defense, and he was cleared by a coroner's jury. And so this was the official narrative that sort of lingered, especially in Lake County and Florida, for so many decades. After I published this book, after the prize, people started reading it. And it was being read down here in the Florida legislature. And they had a competition to see who could get more co-sponsors of a bill that would bring some kind of relief to correct this grave injustice. And I got a phone call from a state legislator that said, he said, "You better get down here. I think this bill is going to pass." And so I went down to Tallahassee. I sat up in the balcony with the families of the Groveland Four. And I remember Speaker Corcoran, he said, "We're here to vote on this claims bill." He goes, "I understand there was some kind of competition about who could get the most sponsors. I don't know what the final tally is. Let's just do it now." And they asked who was going to co-sponsor this bill. And every single member, every single state legislator raised their hand to sponsor the bill. And they all passed it immediately, 117 to nothing. Yeah. And, just sitting there in this balcony and watching this and seeing what that meant to the families, all those state representatives turned to the balcony and they put their hands on their heart and they said, on behalf of the state of Florida, we officially apologize for this gross injustice. We are recommending to the governor that they be pardoned. I didn't really know what to think about that. Now it becomes a different kind of thing, but all of a sudden, it was an election year, and I started to see, I was seeing this on TV, I'd get these weird emails saying, watch the news tonight. I'm like, I don't even know who these people are who are emailing me. And I watched the news tonight, and there's Marco Rubio saying, the time has come to correct this gross injustice of the Groveland boys. And some political momentum started to happen. And as it was became kind of a campaign issue. And I think at one point, Governor DeSantis, wasn't governor then, said, that's going to be one of the first things I do when I get into office. And I remember thinking, maybe, But sure enough, I think he was in the office maybe 2 or 3 days. He called a meeting of the clemency board. And we just thought, well, he's just going to put it on the agenda. We all show up. All the family members were represented. I was there. And then I get a text saying, by the way, there's going to be somebody else testifying. It was Norma Paget. She hadn't spoken to anybody in 70 years. I tried to ask her if she would talk. It's one of my great regrets that she didn't speak to me. I just felt like, she sometimes gets the, reputation of starting this whole thing, where I've always believed that it was the men in her life that sort of led her down. It was never her story. It was Sheriff Willis McCall's story. It was her husband's story. It was the prosecutor's story. I wanted to get her story and just have her talk. She didn't have to talk about anything she didn't want to. I would just like to know about the pressures that she felt being in this situation where you have, the Klansmen and Thurgood Marshall coming in and people getting killed left and right. But her message to me was, let sleeping dogs lie. But she did show up that day and she spoke and said, I am against these pardons, and stuck to her story. And it got a little bit contentious in there. And I remember they asked me to go up and speak and sort of bring it back to the history. And the message I tried to do in my testimony was that this is not a he said, she said kind of scenario. We are here to discuss this injustice because of what happened in that courtroom by representatives of the state, the perjury, manufactured evidence, prosecutorial misconduct at every turn. That's why we're here, about what happened to these defendants in that courtroom. And sure enough, by this point, the Florida Senate had also voted unanimously. So now it came down to the pardon board, the clemency board, 4 members. And they decided to vote right then on the spot. And again, it was 4-0, unanimous. So now the Groveland boys are pardoned and they've been apologized. So this is, the government and also the legislature. Now, the last thing is the judicial branch, where this case took place. Families were very polite. They accepted the apology and the pardon, but they wanted an exoneration because, a pardon is like saying we forgive you for what you did. But the Groveland families were like, they didn't do anything. We want exoneration. And so what ended up happening as a result of that board meeting was that Ashley Moody, the Attorney General, who's also on the clemency board, she started an investigation. She had the FDLE go in and reinvestigate this case. And they took about 2 years to do this case. Very thorough. 2 agents came up to me at the library in New York and asked for all my files. So I had everything. I was like a pack rat. Kept everything. And I just turned it over to them. And so they put together a report. And come to find out, the state attorney in Lake County, 5th Circuit, Bill Gladson, called me up. And he said, look, there's no legal path to exoneration in the state of Florida. Can't really do this. The only way to do it, because all the defendants are deceased, is to have new evidence. And he said, well, do you have any new evidence? I said, I don't know if I have any new evidence, but I can tell you a couple things happened. I got a letter from the grandson of the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, and this was just about 2 years ago, and he basically said, Mr. King, you of all people should know the mask my grandfather had to wear in order to be elected state attorney in Lake County. He said, it was common knowledge within my family and in the family of the judge that the Groveland boys were innocent. They knew it, but they decided to prosecute him anyway. And when I told State Attorney Gladson that, he's like, what? Can I see that email? I sent him the email. I think the very next day, he went up and interviewed the grandson and got the whole story. Found out that there was actually correspondence between the two families talking about this. Still hearsay, but it was something that documented the story. State Attorney Gladson, for some reason, he wasn't going to take no for an answer. He felt that he was sort of hamstrung by the law, but he wanted to find out about new evidence. And so we had these discussions about the trial evidence. I tried to get my hands on the trial evidence. All of it disappeared. I couldn't find it. I spent years trying to find it in every courthouse, every records request I could possibly do. Bill Gladson just got in his truck and started going to the courthouses and going into the vaults. And he found this box sitting in there that shouldn't have been sitting there. It was mislabeled or something. Opened up the box, and they were the pants that Walter Irvin was wearing on the night that the prosecutor used during both trials to say, do you see this stain right here on the leg? And he said, that is a semen stain. And it's been tested, and it's officially linking Walter Irvin to the crime. Both juries heard this evidence. It was part of the evidence that convicted Walter Irvin. So State Attorney Gladson took those pants, took them to the FDLE the next day, had them DNA tested. And they said that stain is not a human stain. And they could tell that. They can tell stuff from dinosaur days. So they could look at a stain and establish that it was not a stain. And so he said that is new evidence because the prosecutor represented this as evidence, factual evidence, when they never tested it. And so now he said, I'm going to draw up a motion. Oh, in front of the Lake County Courthouse in Tavares, this monument now sits. This was part of the effort to sort of acknowledge the efforts. And you can see Governor DeSantis. I'm over to the left looking like a crazy person. And it was a very cold day that day. But you can see that monument still there. I saw it fairly recently. Next. State Attorney Gladson wrote a motion calling for the dismissal of charges of all four members of the Groveland Four, even though it was very complicated legally because Ernest Thomas was shot in the swamp, so he was never convicted. So it's a very complicated process to exonerate someone who's shot dead and not convicted. And some of them, it's a complicated thing. All four members of the Groveland Four had different legal dilemmas. And so what Gladson came upon was said, but I can dismiss the charges. Then the judicial branch is saying they never should have been charged, so it's a restoration of innocence. And he told the family members, and the family members said, if you can do that, that's the same as an exoneration as far as we're concerned. There may not be a legal path to the term exoneration, but it's an exoneration. It's basically saying the state is clearing them. He wrote this motion. I have to say, it was one of the most impressive motions I've ever read. How much time he put into this. And I was talking to him constantly on the phone. He was very careful. He wanted it to read a certain way. It was really unambiguous. It was damning. He really held his predecessors to task for this gross injustice. It was really one of the most impressive civil rights documents, and it was only drawn up last year. I encourage everyone to read it. It's on the state attorney's website. Go ahead, next. Just this past November, he gets his motion into court. And you can see him here. He's arguing for the dismissal of these charges. All the Groveland families are there. A lot of people showed up, spilled out into the hallway and into another room where they had a video. At the end, the judge basically said, it is my extreme honor to formally dismiss all charges against the Groveland Four. And so it was settled right here in the Lake County Courthouse just in November. And that's kind of the end of this story. I'll just flip through a couple slides here to show you. Go ahead, Daryl. You can see the reaction. This is Carol Greenlee, who, ironically, 72 years old. She was born the same year of this Groveland case. And she was just a very big part of all this, sort of the leader of the Groveland Four, extraordinarily well-spoken, passionate, and at the end, when she heard that the charges for her father had been dismissed, she just broke down. And she just said, I can't believe I've witnessed this. What I've been trying to do my whole life is to clear my father's name, and finally did it. Next. Oh, in the original Lake County Courthouse, where this trial took place, where the Groveland Four were taken into the basement and beaten severely until they confessed, and where Sheriff Willis McCall had his office, that's where they had the press conference. And you can see it was packed in there as well. All the family members spoke. Go ahead, Daryl. What's really interesting is that in his research, Bill Gladson, just, I don't know how he does it, but I told him, if this doesn't work out for you, come to work with me because you're an unbelievable investigator. While he was doing this research and going into these courthouses, he found the chairs that Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers sat on that were being held in storage. And so you can see that those are the ones up in Ocala. Go ahead, next. Well, he put him in the back of his minivan and brought him back to Lake County. And you can see on the right, somebody had indicated which was the actual chair that Thurgood Marshall was sitting in for the second trial. And so these chairs are now back in existence in the I think they're in the state attorney's office. Next. One of the little surprises that I did, I came down for this as well, of course. I brought Thurgood Marshall Jr. with me, and you can see him second from the left. And he got to pose and sit in the chairs with the Groveland families and have all these photographs taken. And when I introduced them to the Groveland family, they were just, it was a shock. They were just, thank you for coming. It was so beautiful. And Marshall got up there and spoke. And one of the things he said was, growing up and hearing these stories, my father's heroes were his clients. And he never stopped talking about this case. And so he said, I was extraordinarily familiar with this case growing up because that's what my father wanted to tell me. Stories about going up against the sheriff and justice in the South and all those, but he focused on the Groveland case. And I remember I was reading a biography of Sandra Day O'Connor, and she mentions it in her book. She goes, nothing more fascinating than going into Thurgood Marshall's office and hearing these stories about some crazy sheriff down in Florida. She goes, we just thought he was making it up. It was so crazy, and here it is, a real story. Go ahead, next. And there's Carol Greenlee with a picture of her father. Her father only passed away in 2012. He served 10 years in prison, was released, became a very successful businessman in terms of heating and air conditioning in Tennessee. And finally, Carol had justice for her father. Next. And there you go. It was covered in the news. It got a great deal of coverage and publicity. And, they used the word exonerated because that's exactly what it was. So that is the end of the Groveland story, and I'll bring Daryl up right now. But thank you very much for listening. We'll take some questions. Thank you.